everybody, and happy Wednesday. Because it's Wednesday, we don't have our class meeting. We wanted to add in another activity for you guys to be working on Wednesdays, and that is in the form of this binder, which you all got on the last supply pickup, and it's the Time for Kids binder. And we're going to start with that today, and we're going to be reading here in just a moment an article, the cover story on this first Time for Kids edition, the September 2020 edition. So we're going to be reading that in just a moment, and then there's going to be an activity to go along with it. So here's what we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and just read this out loud. If you don't want to follow along with me and you just want to read it on your own, totally okay. You can pause it there and then just read it on your own and then complete the activity. For the activity, when you're all done, there's going to be a link in your Seesaw to a Google form, which is a little bit of a quiz or survey, I guess you could say, of questions asking you to respond to that article. So once you're done reading, click that link. It'll take you into that survey, and you can fill out those questions just to get a gauge on how you understood it and help you process it a little bit more. So if you want to follow along with me, stay right here, and let's get started. Time for Kids, Kids March. On the march. For decades, kids have led the way in the fight for civil rights. On August 28th, thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington 2020. They were protesting the unjust treatment of black people. For months, marches have taken place in the United States. They started after a man named George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota in May. Equality is why we are here today, Yolanda Renee King told the crowd. We stand and march for love, and we will fulfill my grandfather's dream. Yolanda is 12. She's the granddaughter of Martin Luther King Jr. She spoke on the same date that King gave his I Have a Dream speech 57 years ago. That was during the 1963 March on Washington, a milestone in the struggle for civil rights. Like the 1963 March, this year's march attracted a diverse group of all ages, including kids. Young people have played an important role in the civil rights movement for decades. They continue to be leaders in the fight for social justice. A look at history. In May 1963, thousands of black kids in Birmingham, Alabama joined the Children's Crusade as they walked out of school to protest segregation. They marched singing, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Freeman Hrabowski was 12 years old at the time. He decided to march when Martin Luther King Jr. visited his church. King asked kids for help. He believed in us, that we have a role to play. Hrabowski told Time for Kids. Hrabowski's parents let him march. They were aware of the dangers that existed at the time, but they felt it was worth the risk. Some of the marchers were arrested. They spent a few days in jail. Hrabowski was one of them. The march worked. Americans watched it on television. They saw how police treated kids in Birmingham. More people began to talk about how bad things were, Hrabowski says. The civil rights movement gained support. The 1963 March on Washington took place a few months later. It drew 250,000 people. It pushed the U.S. Congress to outlaw discrimination against black people. Positive change. Americans are still fighting racism, and children are still speaking out. Kids' marches have taken place in cities all over the country, including Kirkwood, Missouri, New Orleans, Louisiana, and North Las Vegas, Nevada. Aiden Carter is 10 years old. He's in 5th grade. Aiden's mom let him organize a march in Portland, Oregon in June. Portland has seen many protests lately. Some of the protests have turned violent, but Aiden's march was different. Many of the hundreds who joined him were kids. They came with their families. Some rode bikes. Bullhorn in hand, Aiden led the crowd in a chant, Black Lives Matter. I felt like one of the big people, Aiden says. Even though you're little, you can still be brave and stand up for rights. Aiden's mom, Alicia Carter, is proud of her son. Sometimes you have to do tough things to help your community, she says. It's important for Aiden to see that he can make a positive change. Speaking up. Also in June, hundreds of young people attended a kids' march in St. Paul, Minnesota. Baylor Peterson, 11, joined in with her parents and sister. Little kids are smart enough to see that racism is not okay, Baylor says. Sonia Peterson is Baylor's mom. We want our daughters to be aware of the privilege they carry as white people, she says. They should use their voice and power to help others. Maggie Barnes organized the march. She owns a daycare center in St. Paul. She wanted to give kids a safe way to voice her feelings. Children have a lot to say. If they are given a chance, Barnes says, they have a right to be seen, to be heard. Better tomorrow. The kids' marches and the March on Washington 2020 remind Freeman Hrabowski of something Martin Luther King Jr. told him and other young protesters in 1963. Tomorrow can be better than today. For Hrabowski, that has proven true. In the 1960s, I could not have imagined seeing large numbers of families who were not black out protesting and saying Black Lives Matter. He says, that's not something we should take for granted. On the bottom of the page, it says, Art for Justice. Taking part in a march or large protest isn't the only way to fight for equality. Some kids write letters to local and national leaders. Others raise money to support groups that help people. Lately, some young people have been using art as a form of protest. Kids all over the country are showing support for social justice issues by writing messages with sidewalk chalk. It's a quieter way to protest that can still make a big impression. And then these picture captions say, for the kids, Maggie Barnes leads the June March in St. Paul, Minnesota. Kids have a right to be seen and be heard. Well, I hope you enjoyed reading that article along with me. Now you can go ahead and click that link to that Google form to fill out that survey. And if you need to look back on me reading at all as you're looking through that survey, feel free. If there's a question you're like, I'm trying to remember what that part said, feel free to just go backwards in this video and find that part where we read that together and refer to that if you need to. So go ahead and do that and then hit submit, and we will see your answers on our end.